Okay, thank you so much, Patrick, for the introduction. I'll just give myself a brief introduction as well. So hello, everyone. My name is Chewy. I'm the founder and one of the tutors here at Cogito Tutoring. I am currently a law student. I'm about to go into my 4th year of law, so hopefully I'll be able to find a good law job next year, but we'll have to see about that. I've also been studying philosophy in university, which involves a lot of logic and critical thinking. So I'm going to take you through today something that we've broken down. Recently, the New South Wales government has released a new sample set of questions for the new selective exam. So I'm going to take you through a presentation. We're going to break down all the different types of questions, what are the best way to approach them, and also future study, things that we should be looking forward to in the future. So if everyone is ready to go, I think there are still some people joining, but I'll just get started with a quick intro on the course. Let me just share my screen now. Okay, let me know if no one can see the presentation well. Just let one of the hosts know, otherwise I will just get started. Is everything looking good, Robin? Yep, fantastic. Okay, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about the brand new selective schools section. It's a new part of the exam that's replaced the old general ability section, and it is easier in some ways, but it is also more challenging in other ways. So today we're going to be taking you through a few strategies on how to approach this new section and do extremely well. So I'll be taking you through a bunch of different categories of questions, as well as some general tips. And of course, I'll leave a little bit of time at the end for anyone who has any questions about the selective schools exam, this particular section specifically, as well as maybe some of the other things that Cogito Tutoring offers to help students get through this part of the exam. So let me briefly introduce what the new thinking skills section is. Now, don't worry too much about this diagram on the right. It's just a fun little diagram about logic that I thought I'd include, but don't worry too much about that bit. So, like I said before, the new thinking skills section replaces the old general ability section. Now, put up your hand if you've done a bit of GA in the past and you kind of know what I'm talking about, yeah? So the GA section in the past had a lot of different questions, okay? It had everything from various types of maths questions, spatial reasoning. There were some vocabulary questions as well. Does anyone remember the vocabulary questions like, oh, which word is most similar to this word and stuff like that? There were also lots of pattern-based questions and statistics-based questions. Now, the new thinking skills section is a direct replacement for the general ability section. Now, one way it has gotten a little bit easier than before is there's actually a narrower range of content. So what I mean by that is there aren't the same types of questions anymore. There used to be a really broad range of questions, like I said just then, including things like vocabulary, which aren't as heavily tested in this particular section. They might still be tested in the comprehension and reading sections. So there are some similar styles of questions like before. For example, there will be still a few mathematics questions and spatial reasoning questions like put up your hand if you know what I'm talking about, where there's like 3 shapes and they're asking you to find the next shape in the pattern. I'm sure all of you have done a couple of questions like that as well. So those are still in there and they're still just as easy as before. We're not going to be going through those questions specifically because I'm sure you have lots of practice questions at home to tackle those sorts of questions. Today, we're going to focus on the new content that they've added, which is quite a significant chunk and quite a new part of the content of the selective school exam. Now, what is this new content? The new content focuses specifically on logical reasoning. It's all about logic and it's all about finding arguments, evidence, and conclusions. Now, this might not sound very hard, but if you look through your exam, you'll find that the biggest challenge is actually not necessarily that the individual questions are that challenging themselves, but it's actually the time pressure. You only have 40 minutes to complete 40 questions, which means, obviously, simple maths, on average, you have to be getting through a question per minute. Now, this can be a little challenging, which means we need to have a good strategy of approaching those types of questions. What is the best way to save time and how can we ensure that we are accurate? Now, the other problem is a lot of these questions, unlike before, involve a lot of reading. So can everyone remember the old GA exam, how the questions were all really short? They were all kind of like one sentence or maybe one little sentence and then a couple of answers, most of them anyway. The new exam features quite long questions which have really big scenarios. Luckily, one of the things we're going to be talking about today is we're going to find what information is actually relevant and what information is not so relevant in the particular exam. So that's what we're going to be doing today, and let's keep going. Cool. So like I said before, the workshop will specifically focus on the new content. The old content, I'm sure you'll be able to revise yourself, just basic mathematics and pattern-based questions. Okay, so if anyone is taking notes, I encourage you maybe should start taking notes now, especially because I think I'm about to provide you some pretty interesting strategies and useful tips. So if anyone wants to take some notes, I would encourage taking notes starting from this point. Now, the general approach, this is something we have to talk about. Doesn't matter what type of question you're doing, and this is something we'll still cover in the future, the types of questions and the categories of questions. But the overall approach, we're going to call the evidence conclusion approach. It's a really simple 3-step process of solving any kind of logical reasoning question, which is where we're going to focus on today. The evidence conclusion approach ensures that you always get the right answer as long as you're thinking really, really accurately and you're not making silly mistakes. So the first step in the evidence conclusion approach is you have to filter out all the background information. Now, what that means is you have to figure out what in the question is actually relevant and what is just what we call flavor text. Okay, something that adds to the flavor or the spice of the question, but it's not actually that useful in answering the question itself. Now, part of this obviously means that you have to read the question first. Okay, so every single question, you have to read it thoroughly and read what exactly it's asking you to do. Then you'll be able to filter out what we call the background information, the stuff that isn't relevant, the stuff that it's not going to help us get to an answer. The second step in the evidence conclusion approach is we have to find the premises or the evidence for the question. Now, what that means is once you realize what the question is asking you to do, and all of this is going to get clarified and applied, so if you're feeling a little confused now, don't worry. You have to find the evidence or what we call the premises of the question. Which sentences in this question are going to be useful do we need to apply to actually help us solve the question? Now, importantly in this step, and this is one area where a lot of kids that I've taught, especially on this new content, make some mistakes, is that they tend to use their own opinions and their pre-existing knowledge. So they might read a question and they might think, hey, I know something about, say it's a question about 2 people who are arguing about airplane travel, okay, for example. And the student might think, hey, I know something about airplane travel. One of my hobbies is airplane travel. I know a lot about airplanes, and they might use their own knowledge to try to answer the question. That is a big no. You're often going to make a mistake if you try to introduce your own opinions or pre-existing knowledge, what you think is right. It's really important in these questions to only use the evidence that they give you. Does everyone kind of understand that? You can only use what they've told you in the question. You should not be bringing in any of your own opinions because it'll always lead you astray. Finally, step 3 is finding the conclusion. So you need to come to some sort of conclusion based on the evidence that you found in part 2. Okay, so you have to come to a conclusion only based on that information. Now, there's one particular thing you have to note. It's called an intermediate conclusion. You might be tricked in some questions because there are actually 2 conclusions, right? There's actually one that's kind of in the middle and then one that's your actual answer. Sometimes it's not enough just to find one piece of information. Sometimes you need to use that piece of information that you found to find another piece of information that's your final answer. Now, one more thing before I move on. I'm sorry, this is obviously quite abstract at the moment, but we're about to get into the specifics and the nitty-gritty. One more thing we have to note is these 3 things don't always have to be in this order, okay? Keep that in mind. Now, it says here, it seems like we always go background information, premises, conclusion, but that's not always how it is. Sometimes they'll mix it up a little bit. Sometimes they'll give you the conclusion in the question and you have to find the evidence that supports it. Does everyone understand what I'm talking about? So you're not always going to be doing things in the 1, 2, 3 order. There might be a jumble of them and it's our job to figure out and think about things very, very clearly. Okay, so let's move on to then, what are the categories of the question that we've discovered? Now, for the next few slides, we're going to be talking about the sample questions only, the ones that have been released by the government. Obviously, that's not to say that those are the only types of questions they could test on. There could be different types of questions, but we're not going to go into that much detail on potential questions which may or may not happen, because obviously we want to keep this workshop nice and concise and not too confusing. So let's have a look at, well, what are the types of questions that have been released in this New South Wales government thinking skills question paper? Now let's focus specifically on the first two dot points here. At Cogito Tutoring, I've helped identify three main categories of questions that pop up quite a lot. And we're going to be going through each of those three categories with examples to show you how best to approach them. Now, by far, the most common categories of questions in this new thinking skills section, we're going to call 1, logical consequence questions, 2, strength and weaken questions, and 3, identify the flaw questions. Now, we're going to be going through each of those and talking a little bit about what they mean in just a second. Now, the sample paper also features one question, only 1 out of 40, which is a different type, called explaining a conclusion. Now, that is a little more challenging, but we'll get to that towards the end of the workshop. Finally, the selective schools exam may also contain other questions, but we didn't see them in the sample exam. These include things like finding a principle, providing a summary, resolving a dispute, and figuring out different types of assumptions. Now, we're not going to be going over that in the workshop, but Cogito Tutoring is going to hold holiday workshops which go through potential future questions as well, so you get a very broad focus. But today, we're just going to be focusing on everything that we discovered in the selective schools sample test. So we're not going to go beyond what the government has released. So let's look at a quick breakdown of the new content. Now, everything that I've said so far in the thinking skills exam, out of 40 questions, there are 25 which are this totally new type of logical thinking question, which means we need to get very good at it, right? Because it's over half of the actual exam. Now, out of those, there are 13 logical consequence questions. That's a crazy amount. That's almost a third. In fact, it's more than a third of the entire exam. Then, of course, we have strengthen and weaken questions, of which there are 7, which means there's quite a lot of them, and they're quite challenging as well. We found 4 find the flaw questions, and finally, right at the very end, we also found this kind of rare category called explain the conclusion. Now, we're going to take you through all 4 categories of these questions to explain how to solve them, and I'm going to take you through a couple of examples for each one as well, just so you understand all the tricks and how to approach each thing accurately and well. But like I said, there's so many of them that we need to get this right. 25 out of 40 is no small amount. All right, let's start with the most common type of question, 13 out of 40. 13 out of 40 questions, almost a third of the entire exam, you're going to be spent doing these questions. Now, we're going to call them logical consequence questions because you have to find the consequence of the evidence that they give you. Now, can everyone recall 3 slides ago how I talked about the background information, evidence, conclusion approach? Yes? Now, the logical consequence type question is the most common type, where they will give you a bunch of different premises that are true. They are 100% true. You can't question them. Don't bring in your own knowledge about airplanes and things like that. They're 100% true. And then what you have to do is, out of the 4 multiple choice answers, find the only possible true conclusion from the given premises. Does everyone understand what I'm going on about? Yeah. So you'll have lots of different premises in the question. There might be, up to 5 or 6 sometimes different rules. And then you have to find the only possible conclusion. Now, what is special about logical consequence questions is there is a certain right answer. Okay, it's not an opinion thing. It's not what's more likely or what's more persuasive. It's kind of like maths, right? If we think about logic like maths, how maths always has a right or wrong answer. Well, logical consequence questions are like that as well. There is always a certainly right answer without a shadow of a doubt. You're going to find one that is 100% correct. So think of it that way. If there's only one that's 100% correct, Therefore, we can't have multiple ones which we're debating against. There's always one which is the most and certainly, definitely accurate. Now, because there are so many of these, logical consequence questions generally aren't particularly difficult. The only difficult part about logical consequence questions are, and this is something we're going to get into a bit later, two things. One, the time pressure, and two, silly mistakes from being not careful with reading. Now, put up your hand if you've made a silly mistake by reading the question too fast. I know I have. I certainly have. I'm sure all of you have as well. It's the most annoying type of mistake to make because you know you can get the question right, but unfortunately, you just read it too fast or you read it a little inaccurately. Logical consequence questions, because they're so specific and there's always a right answer, you have to read things carefully. Now, the best way of solving logical consequence questions is first to read the question and then step through each multiple choice and ask yourself, is this conclusion necessarily true? If it's only sometimes true or possibly true, then it's not the right answer. It has to be the only one that is certainly true. So let's look at two different examples. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click over to the next slide. I'll give everyone 1 minute to have a look at the question and come up with an answer themselves. And then we're going to walk through how best to analyze the question. Now, remember, try to use the strategy that I taught you before. Filter out the background information. Which parts of the question aren't really that relevant? Which parts of the evidence or the premises? And finally, which of the conclusions is the correct one? Is everyone ready? Cool. Let's go to the first example. 1 minute on the clock and have a read. Okay, another 30 seconds. Carefully think of this, especially you can maybe even jot down some notes as well. I definitely recommend working with a pencil on a piece of paper to try to figure out the answer. Okay, if everyone's ready, let's move on to an analysis. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm not going to do the most efficient analysis. So in the exam, I don't mean you should necessarily get out 3 colors of highlighters and do what I'm doing, but I'm going to break down the question for you so we can get used to seeing the question in these different parts. Is everyone ready? Okay, so there's going to be a lot of colors on the next page, all right? Cool. So this is a breakdown of the question in the structure that we talked about. Now, I've labeled down here what each of the colors mean. Now, the light blue is background information. So does it actually matter whether the survey is for television viewers? Of course not, right? Television is totally irrelevant. So we can just ignore that part of the question. We don't even need to think about television at all. Next, we have the premises. This is the evidence, right? This is the rules that we need to look at in order to come to a conclusion. So what are the premises here? Everyone who liked volleyball likes skiing. Everyone who likes skiing likes cycling, but no one who likes skiing liked gymnastics. Okay, no one who likes skiing liked gymnastics. So if those are our premises, that means all 4 of our answers are the possible conclusions for these premises, the possible conclusions. So like I said, the best way of doing these sorts of questions is to step through each one line by line, the multiple choice, and think about, hey, is this necessarily true? Now let's look at the 4 answers here. A says, if Darren likes cycling, he also likes skiing. If Darren likes cycling, He also likes skiing. Now, is that necessarily true? Anyone? It's not necessarily true, right? It's not necessarily true because everyone who liked volleyball likes skiing, and everyone who likes skiing likes cycling. Okay, so if Darren likes cycling, he also likes skiing, well, that doesn't really seem to follow from any of the rules that we've been given. If he liked skiing, okay, he would also like cycling. But if he likes cycling, there's nothing that tells us he has to like skiing as well. Does everyone see how that logic works? So we have to be careful, okay? This first one is trying to confuse you because if we look at that second rule, everyone who likes skiing likes cycling, well, it doesn't logically follow. If it said if Darren likes skiing, then he likes cycling, then that would be correct. However, this is not that. Let's look at the next one. If Amanda does not like gymnastics, she does not like cycling. Okay, is this one necessarily true? Okay, for a similar reason, I would probably say this is not necessarily true, right? Let's step through the logic. If Amanda does not like gymnastics, she does not like cycling. Well, that doesn't seem to follow from any of the premises that we've been given. If everyone who likes volleyball likes cycling, and everyone who likes skiing, and everyone who likes skiing likes cycling, well, if Amanda does not like gymnastics, that doesn't really have anything to do with whether she does or does not like cycling, right? It doesn't seem to follow. So let's keep stepping through these answers at a quicker pace now. If Lee does like volleyball, he does not like skiing. Well, that's obviously not true because from the first rule, we know that everyone who liked volleyball likes skiing. Does that make sense? So if Lee likes volleyball, he has to like skiing. So that can't be right as well. And now that we've deducted all the answers, okay, let's look at the fourth one. If Jess likes volleyball, she does not like gymnastics. Well, if Jess likes volleyball, she must like skiing. But no one who likes skiing likes gymnastics, which means that one is necessarily true. That's the certain right answer. Does everyone see what I'm saying? Now I'm stepping through this first one very slowly so that people can see the logic at work. Does everyone see how a logical consequence question, there can only be one right answer? The other ones are all definitely wrong, and there's one that's definitely right. So for this question, the answer would be D. Let's keep going. Second example, once again, take a minute to read, and then we're going to step through and analyze the question just like we did then. Now this one is a little bit more tricky, okay? It introduces a bunch of different names and stuff like that, so we have to be very careful with which parts we think are relevant and which parts we think aren't. Another 20 seconds just for everyone to have a read. Excuse me while I have a drink of water. I've been speaking for a while. Okay, let's do the same thing as before. Let's analyze this question and break it down. Now, one part of this question that isn't present is, well, all the information seems pretty relevant, okay? There's not really any information that is extra that we can completely ignore. But what's different about this question? Well, they've put the conclusion already in the question itself. You just have to agree with which conclusions are correct. Does everyone see how the conclusion's actually in the question? Compared to the previous one, we had to find the conclusion ourselves. This one, we have to assess whether or not these people's conclusions are right or wrong. So let's look at the different premises. The premise here is to become a successful architect, you need to be creative and also have excellent attention to detail. Okay, keep those in mind. To be a good architect, you need to be creative and have excellent attention to detail. Now, what does Will say? And this is one part of the question that's a bit confusing, okay? Will, Sally, Evie, James, there's a lot of names going on, so we have to be very careful with who is talking about who. So for this type of question, Will says, Sally is creative, she loves drawing and painting, and always checks her written work carefully. She's sure to become a great architect. Evie says, James always enjoys writing stories and has a vivid imagination, but he struggles with detailed tasks. Architecture is probably not for him. Architecture is probably not for him. Now let's look and assess these different premises and conclusions. Okay, let's look at and assess these different premises and conclusions. To become a successful architect, you need to be creative and have excellent attention to detail. Now, what about what Will says? Will says, Sally is creative, she loves drawing and painting, and always checks her written work carefully. She's sure to become a great architect. So do we think Sally has come to the right conclusion there? Well, it seems like Sally has come to the right conclusion there. Oh, sorry, Will has come to the right conclusion there. Has he or has he not? Anyone? Now, what is important about this is, and this is one question which we can clearly see might be a trick question, is remember what I said at the start of the lesson? I said at the start of the lesson that we cannot bring in our own external knowledge, okay? We cannot bring in our own external knowledge into the question, and we can't bring in our own opinions and assumptions. Does that make sense? So this one is a bit of a trick question because always checking her written work carefully, well, that's not necessarily excellent attention to detail. Does everyone understand what I'm getting at there? That's not necessarily the right conclusion because checking written work carefully does not necessarily mean that you have an excellent attention to detail. That could be very, very different things. You could be checking your written work carefully, but for example, when you're doing another task which involves your hands, or to be an architect, you're going to have to do that, then that's not necessarily true. So we can only use what's given to us in the question. And this is where a lot of students actually got this question wrong. Because it seems like Will has come to the right conclusion. She's sure to become a great architect, but some people accidentally read always checks her written work carefully as excellent attention to detail. Now, if the premises do not refer to detail, then you can't bring in your extra opinions and say, well, anyone who checks their written work carefully probably has excellent attention to detail, because that would be using your own knowledge. We can only use the premises as they've been given. Does that make sense to everyone? We've only used what they say. We can't bring in our own knowledge because you got to think about this like maths. And this is why lots of people got this question wrong. Now let's look at the second one. James enjoys writing stories and has a vivid imagination, but he struggles with detailed tasks. Architecture is probably not for him. Now this one seems more correct. This one seems more correct because writing stories and having a vivid imagination means creative. Okay, there's basically synonyms. But always checks her written work carefully doesn't necessarily mean, okay, that they have an excellent attention to detail. So therefore, the only person's reasoning who's correct is Evie. So the answer would be B. And a lot of people got this wrong, okay? A lot of people got this wrong because they were too quick to equate checking written work carefully with excellent attention to detail. Does everyone understand what I'm going on about? Okay, let's move on to the next category of question. The next category of question are strengthen, weaken questions. These ones are not as easy and not as simple as logical consequence questions. And this is why we need to be super careful. And the example is going to be very enlightening. Okay, so everyone needs to really pay attention because I think strengthen, weaken questions are the hardest type of question in this new exam. So everyone needs to listen up very carefully. These are the hardest type of question. Now, the reason these are the hardest types of questions are they can be a little vague. They can be a little ambiguous. Put up your hand if you know what I mean by vague and ambiguous. Yeah? They're not going to have a 100% certainly right answer. Does that make sense to everyone? It's not like a maths thing where you can deduce, and then come up with the right answer. This is a little bit harder. Now, what does a strengthen or a weaken question ask you to do? First off, how do we know it's a strengthen or weaken question? They will use the words strengthen or weaken in the question. So the question will say something like, which of the following strengthens or weakens this person's argument? What is it asking us to do? Essentially, the person in the question will make an argument and come to a conclusion. So they'll give you both the evidence and the conclusion in the question. Now, you're not asked to prove whether it's right or wrong. All you're asked to do is to provide the answer that best strengthens the conclusion that they've made. Does everyone understand what I'm talking about? So it just makes it a little bit stronger. It doesn't prove it right or wrong. It just makes what they're saying a little bit more persuasive. Put up your hand if you've done a little bit of debating here as well and you know kind of what I mean by making things more persuasive. Basically, you need to find the answer that makes the question, what they're saying, more convincing. What makes it more convincing? Now, the important thing is, and we're going to see this in the question, they don't have to be, the answers, the multiple choice answers, they don't have to be directly relevant to what the person has said. They don't have to be relevant to what the person has said. Now, let me give you a quick example. Let me make an argument on the spot for you, okay? I'm going to make an argument that's like, oh, I think dogs are the most loyal animals because they always wait for you at home until you come back. Okay, that's my argument. Now, one of the answers could be dogs always protect their owners from attackers. Now, that is not relevant at all to what I said about dogs waiting at home. Does that make sense? Yeah, it has nothing to do with it, right? If someone's attacking me, what does that have to do with the dog waiting at home? But does everyone see how that makes my conclusion stronger? Because what was my original conclusion? Dogs are the most loyal animals to humans. That was my conclusion. It doesn't matter what other evidence that I said in the question, whether or not they wait at home. When I've given you something that strengthens the conclusion, that's the right answer. So that's the tricky part of these types of questions. They try to trick you by providing some random evidence, but your answer might not have anything to do with that evidence. Moreover, like I said before, you don't have to prove or disprove the argument with 100% certainty, like the types of questions we just did, the logical consequence questions. You don't have to prove or disprove them with 100% accuracy. All you have to do is to see whether they decrease or increase, depending on whether it's a strengthen or weaken question, the persuasiveness of the argument. Does it make it more believable? Does it make it more convincing? Now, how do we solve these questions? What is the key tip? The key tip is, and this is the one where the outside knowledge is the most harmful, do not overthink the question. Okay, do not overthink and think, oh, maybe, or maybe this, or maybe that, or bring in your own opinions about whether or not it strengthens or weakens. Just ask yourself, does it make the conclusion that the person has said more persuasive? Once again, the best way to approach this question is to step through each of the multiple choices and ask yourself, does this make the conclusion stronger? If it does, then that's probably the right answer. So now let's have a look at an example. Same shtick as always. I'll give you 1 minute to read the question, and then we're going to analyze the question and figure out the right answer. Oh, whoops. Sorry. Showed that slide early. Have another 30 seconds. Okay. Have another look before I give you the analysis of the question. My bad. All right. Now, if everyone thinks they have a right answer, and this one's a tricky question, a lot of our students also got this wrong, which is why we're doing the hard one. Think carefully about each one. Does it strengthen or weaken the argument? Does it? Does it not? All right, let's have a look at my analysis of the question. Now, there's actually going to be a new color introduced because there's a new type of thing here. So don't worry if there's a lot of colors. And we're going to analyze it very carefully, okay? Here we go. Whoa, a pink now. Okay. So there's a bit of background information here that's not relevant, which is Anne's mother has written a letter, okay? No one cares it's a letter. Could be an email, could have been a phone call. Doesn't matter, right? Doesn't matter. We don't care about the letter part. We can ignore that first sentence. Now, Anne's mother has provided a conclusion here. Does everyone see how that's actually a conclusion in our evidence, conclusion, background information, three-way thing? Now, what's her conclusion? Her conclusion is that for the children's safety, cars should be banned from the roads around the school at the beginning and end of day. So that's her argument, otherwise called a conclusion. That's her argument. That's what her argument is. Now, she provides a reason herself, as there is a high risk of a child being involved in an accident. However, the reason she provides does not have to be relevant to the answer that we give. Does that make sense to everyone? It could be. Lots of questions, sometimes there is one that's relevant. However, it doesn't have to be relevant. So the answer we're looking for doesn't necessarily have to do with accidents. Is everyone getting that part of logic? Yeah, it doesn't have to do with accidents. It could. And sometimes questions will give you a free pass like that, but it doesn't have to be. So were some people a little bit confused because they read the question and they read the four answers and they were like, none of these have anything to do with accidents, or, you know, maybe the bad temper one has to do with accidents or something like that, but none of these have to do with accidents, right? They don't have to. They don't have to do with the evidence that Anne's mother herself has provided. All we have to ask ourselves is, do any of the sentences here make the conclusion stronger? Now, what's the conclusion? What's the argument? The argument is, for the children's safety, cars should be banned from the roads around the school at the beginning and end of the day. So let's step through each of them, even if we find the right answer first, and find which one's the right one. Now, does the evidence that parents who go to work after taking children to school may be late if they have to walk with their children to school, does that have anything to do with for the children's safety? No, clearly not. That has nothing to do with the children's safety. What does it have to do with? It has to do with the parents' convenience. So that probably isn't it. Now let's look at the second one. When people cannot find a place to park, they get very bad-tempered. Does that have to do with the children's safety? Not really, not at all, okay? Because that answer is not really about children's safety. That answer is just about people's attitudes. Now, you might get, this is what I meant by don't overthink each answer. Now, you might be going down a spiral of thinking and thinking, hey, when people get bad-tempered, they might, have road rage and then accidentally cause an accident or something like that. But don't overthink that. Don't step 3 steps ahead in your thinking by yourself, because then you'll answer the wrong answer. Does that make sense to everyone? Don't jump ahead and start thinking about, oh, what if? We only ask ourselves, hey, does the answer here directly support what has been said? If it doesn't, then we cannot use it. Now let's look at the third one. Exhaust fumes from cars are invisible, but very harmful to children. Does that strengthen our argument? Yes, it does. Now, why does it strengthen our argument? Because the argument is, for the children's safety, cars should be banned from the roads around the school at the beginning and the end of the day. Exhaust fumes are harmful to children, which means they are a threat to the children's safety, which means that's the evidence that supports our argument. Does everyone see how that's a bit of a difficult question? Now let's filter out the last one to see why that's the only right answer. People who live close to school have complained about noise at the beginning and end of the school day. Well, complaining about noise has nothing to do with the children's safety. So let me explain again why C has to be the right answer here. Let me give you the logic again. Now put your hand up if you already understand what I'm saying. Some people, yeah? Other people don't? Now, once again, the trick to strengthen weaken questions is the pink part that I've highlighted does not have to do with your answer at all. It doesn't need to be relevant, okay? You can basically almost ignore that if none of the answers seem similar. It doesn't have to do with accidents, right? That's her reason. That's Anne's mother reason for making this argument. You don't need to use her reason because the argument is that cars should be banned from the roads around the school at the beginning and the end of the day. This is her reason for it. That's not her argument. Does everyone make sense? Does that make sense to everyone? Right? Her argument isn't there is a high risk of a child being involved in an accident. That's not her argument. Her argument is, hey, we should ban cars. That's her argument because for the children's safety. Now, which one of these four answers has to do with children's safety and why we should ban cars around school? Well, clearly the one that threatens children's safety. And this is actually the right answer. These are the government questions with the sample answers. They told us C, and as we can see, C is the only correct solution. Why is that? Because C is the only one that has to do with children's safety. The other ones don't have anything to do with children's safety, or they only have to do with children's safety if you add a bunch of extra stuff that's not there. You can't add extra stuff that's not there. So lots of students accidentally answered B for this question because they added a bunch of extra information that wasn't there, right? They get bad-tempered and then, drivers will have road rage and then accidentally run into children. Well, that's not what the answer says, right? That's adding extra stuff that isn't there. That's using your own opinion. And we can't do that in the thinking skills section. That's the most difficult part of this type of question is not adding extra stuff, not overthinking things. You only ask yourself, hey, is this strengthening the conclusion in a relevant way? If it is, then you have to use that answer. Does everyone understand why C is the right answer to this question? Cool. Let's move on to the third category of question. Now, the third category of question is a little bit similar to strength and weaken questions. There were 4 out of 40, which means it makes up a 10%, 1/10 of the entire exam. So it's still a fairly large chunk of the exam you have to do answering these questions. Now, like the question suggests, identify the flaw means you have to find where someone's made a mistake. Okay, you have to find where someone has made a mistake. What mistake have people made? Now, the question will give you a necessarily false conclusion. So it's similar to a logical consequence question where it's necessarily true, the premises. They're going to give you a conclusion that you know is false. They're going to tell you he's made a mistake here, she's made a mistake here. And it's your job to find where they make the mistake. They're going to give you a bunch of reasons. They're going to give you the evidence. And they're going to give you the conclusion, but you know the conclusion's wrong. So you have to ask yourself, why is the conclusion wrong? Where has the person made the mistake? What has led them to result in answering the false conclusion? Now, one easy way of asking or answering this question is you ask yourself, has the person who's come to this false conclusion made any assumptions? Have they leapt ahead in their logic? Have they failed to consider something? Have they thought something is true when it's not necessarily true? Does everyone understand what I mean by assumption? They've made an assumption that's wrong. That's probably where the mistake is. Now, similar to strengthen or weaken questions, there might be multiple answers which have some maybe small, tiny mistake. But just like we said for strengthen and weaken questions, you can't add extra stuff that's not there. But don't think ahead. Don't add extra premises by yourself and start creating a whole short story in your head. about how drivers are going to get angry and then drive really badly and stuff like that. Okay, don't add extra stuff that isn't there. Only ask yourself which of these answers is intuitively, using your common sense, okay, and I'm going to show you in the next question why you have to use common sense, which of these seems like the mistake that the person has made. Now, this next question, a lot of our students got wrong as well because, like I said, they overthought it. They saw one answer and they thought a lot and they added all these extra details that didn't exist in the question, and they picked that answer instead, even though there was an answer that was so much more obvious staring them in the face. So once again, we have to find the mistake. The conclusion is false. They tell you that. You know it's false. So where is the mistake in the question? Now let's have a look at our practice example. 1 minute once again to have a go. Okay, another 30 seconds. Another 30 seconds to have a look at the question. Remember, thinking skills is all about accuracy. Don't overthink it. Don't add stuff that's not there. Only look at what's given in the question. Okay, who feels like they're ready to go? Yeah, some people? All right, let's have a look at our analysis first. So what do we have here? Well, we have some premises, right, that we know are true, but we know the conclusion is false. And how do we know the conclusion is false? Because the question says Sam has made a mistake. That's why we always read the question, right? We have to figure out what we're doing first. So we always read this third paragraph. Everyone see this third paragraph? Which one of the following sentences shows the mistake that Sam has made? So once we read the question first, which we should always do, we know, okay, what Sam has said is a mistake. It's false. How do we know it's false? Or why is it not necessarily true? Now let's step through each of the 4 answers and see, hey, which of these is a possible mistake that Sam has made? Let's step through each of them. And once again, we always like taking things away. We test one and we take things away. Okay, if it isn't right, we just cross it out. We don't have to worry about it anymore. Now, the first answer is obviously not the mistake, okay? Because there's nothing in the question about whether or not people deserve prizes or not, right? Some people might deserve a prize even if they didn't score a hole-in-one. Well, there's nothing about what people deserve. We're not making value judgments here, like, oh, you're a better golf player, so you deserve a prize. Totally irrelevant, right? So clearly, it isn't about that. Now let's look at B. The hole-in-one might have been scored by a player who finished first, second, or third. Well, that seems like a more likely mistake. And in fact, it does look like the most likely mistake via our common sense. Okay, we've got to use our common sense here. Now, why does that seem like the mistake that they've made? Because the premises are anyone who finishes first, second, and third, and to anyone who gets a hole-in-one. Now, it doesn't say they give an extra prize, right? They get an extra prize. And the question is about how many players are getting prizes. So even if they did get 2 prizes, it would still be the same number of players. So yeah, it is possible that the person who came first, second, or third also scored a hole-in-one. Plus, it also means that maybe there's extra people who scored holes-in-ones and things like that, but we don't have to worry about that. All we have to do is figure out, well, what is the most likely mistake that Sam has made? Now, the reason we have to use our common sense is this. What is Sam arguing here? What is Sam thinking in his head? We've got to think about, okay, where has he made his assumption, right? He says, well, I know that one player scored a hole in 1 year, this year, so that means that 4 players will get prizes. So what is he thinking in his head? He's thinking first place will get a prize, second place will get a prize, third place will get a prize, and, well, I know one other player did, so that means there's one other player, 4 prizes. But clearly he's made a mistake because one of those 3 players who already got a prize, first, second, and third, might also have been the one who scored the hole in 1. So that's the assumption he's made. He hasn't asked himself, has the same player who's already gotten a prize of finishing on the podium, first, second, or third, did they also get a hole in 1? Now let's look at the other 2 and see why they're not correct. Now, lots of students answered D for this question, but we're going to get to why they probably or mistakenly answered D. Let's look at C. Younger players might find it difficult to score a hole in 1. Well, that's clearly not relevant. That's like A, right? This has nothing to do with age. This is about a junior golf championship. Like, what? Doesn't really matter, right? So the age has nothing to do with this. It's clearly not the mistake that he's made. Now, some students thought they were being super duper extra clever by selecting D. We do not know the total number of players in the competition because they were like, well, what if there's only 2 players in the competition? Right. Well, if there were only 2 players in the competition, yeah, obviously no one would win first, second, or third. But do you see how that's adding extra details in there that don't exist already? The question, in its common sense and the way it's set up, suggests that there's probably going to be a first, second, and third. Not that there's only 2 players in the competition, right? So there's only first, second, and there's no third because that player doesn't exist. So lots of students were like, oh, I'm being so smart because what if there are only 2 players? Well, that's not what the question's saying. Yeah, it's obviously not what the question's suggesting because the question says, hey, there's a first, second, and third, which means there's probably going to be at least 3 players. And it would be a pretty bad competition if there were only 2 players and you were guaranteed a prize of first or second, right? So we don't have to overthink things. That's what happens when you overthink things. You look at D and you think, ooh, what if there were only 2? That's overthinking it, okay? That's not what the question's saying. You're not using your common sense there. You're pushing yourself to go beyond the logic to find some extra stuff that isn't in the question. So if we only look at what's in the question, it's clear that Sam's mistake is B. We think about what Sam is thinking and the type of mistake that he's made in his head. What is he thinking in his head? We quickly realize, hey, it's definitely B. Why? Because he hasn't considered whether or not those 2 things are actually the same thing. Perhaps second place also scored a hole in 1, first place, third place. Doesn't have to be 4. So that's why that's the mistake. Okay, now we're going to move on to our final category. Now, after the final category, I'm going to talk quite extensively about general tips as well and kind of summarize what we've learnt from the 4 categories and what we can take away going into the exam. Now, the last category is a type of category that only appeared once in the exam, which is a little annoying, a very rare category, but it means that they might be throwing in a couple of curveballs at you here and there with this sort of one-time pop-up question. So what is this one time? So there's only 1 out of 40 questions like this, and it's not necessarily in your exam, but it appeared in the New South Wales government sample exam. It is the exact reverse of a logical consequence question. Okay, it's the exact reverse. Now, why is it the exact reverse? Because they'll give you a conclusion in the question, and you have to find an extra piece of evidence that makes the question true, that makes the conclusion true. Does everyone see how that's different from logical consequence? Logical question is they give you all the true pieces of evidence, and you have to find the only true conclusion. This is a bit of a flip on its head. They give you some of the evidence, they give you a true conclusion, and they ask you, hey, what's missing? What is missing? What is the one extra piece of information we need, an additional piece of evidence that will make the conclusion true? So we know that the conclusion is true and we know the other parts are true. We have to find an extra piece of evidence, which is usually not what we do because we usually find the conclusion. So like I said, we need 1 extra premises to make it necessarily true. Now, similar to a logical consequence question, explain the conclusion questions usually only have 1 certain right answer as well. Okay, so it's kind of like maths, right? You're missing a variable, you're missing a number, you got to find the number to make the equation correct. Anyone done a bit of algebra here know what I'm talking about, right? You got to find for X, you got to find for Y. It's like that. right? There's an X or a Y in this question. You have to find what the value is. So we have to find the piece of evidence that I'm missing. So very, very similar to a logical consequence question. We step through the multiple choice answers. We ask ourselves, hey, if we add this, does it make the conclusion true? If it doesn't, cross it out, move on. We don't care about that answer anymore. So let's move on to explain the conclusion, our practice question. Once again, let's take a minute to think very carefully about this question. As you can see, some of these questions involve a lot of reading. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in the future, okay? How to speed up our reading. Whoops, I've accidentally already included the labeling down the bottom, but you can ignore that last line. Make sure you have an answer in your head first that we can think about. Discuss which one is correct. Okay, put up your hand if you think you've got an answer ready. Some people do. Okay, maybe another 15 seconds, 15 seconds. Okay, let's have a look at our breakdown of this question with the highlighters. Here we go. So, like I said, how do we know, what do we do first when approaching any thinking skills question? Everyone, we read the question first so we know what the question's asking us to do. Now, what is the question asking us to do? When the question says something like, what is the explanation or what must have been the reason, that's when you know you need to find an additional piece of information. Does that make sense? We need to find an additional piece of information. Now, some of this is a little bit like a background information, right? So once we read this first sentence once, we don't really need to read it again. We don't need to think about it. Once we know what the scenario is, that's just background information. Does everyone see how that's true? We don't ever need to refer to that question, that sentence again. Obviously, we need to read it once, but we don't need to keep reading it again and again to think about the answer, right? Okay, he was, Jun's at some sort of school and they're doing a test, okay? And because of this test, they need to do a maths and a chess challenge. That's all we have to know. They're doing a maths and a chess challenge. That's all. That's background information, so we can effectively, once we've read it once, ignore the background information, as long as we have it in our heads. So let's look at the premises of the question. If a student had at least some existing knowledge of programming, they only had to pass the maths test. If they had none, then they either needed to get an excellent score on the maths test or do well in both the maths test and the chess challenge. Now we know that Jun is an experienced computer programmer, but, and here's the conclusion, okay, here's the conclusion that we have to find an additional piece of information to make it true. He failed to get a place in the course. Now we're missing a piece of information here because why? We don't know why. We don't know why he failed to get a place in the course, right? It seems like he's an experienced computer programmer. So let's step through the answers and think about whether or not that piece of additional information makes what we're doing, or makes the conclusion, which is he failed to get in, necessarily true. So let's have a look. Question A, he did badly in the chess challenge. Well, this doesn't seem relevant. Why? Because we know Jun is an experienced computer programmer, which means he doesn't have to do the chess challenge, right? Let's look at the first sentence of the premises again. If a student had at least some existing knowledge of programming, and they only had to pass the maths test. So Jun's not even doing a chess challenge at all. So clearly it can't be A. B, and this is where lots of students chose the answer. Lots of students chose B. He did not get an excellent score in maths. Well, that can't be the right answer because let's think about it this way. If he got an excellent score in maths, what's an excellent score in maths to everyone here? Maybe an 85, a 90, a 95, 100, right? Now, if Jun gets 51, that's not an excellent score, right? Put up your hand if you think that's an excellent score in maths. No, don't put up your hand. That's not an excellent score, okay? 51, you don't want to score 51 in maths, right? Jun gets 51 out of 100, okay? That means he still passed the maths test because a pass is 50%, right? That means he still passed. It's clearly not an excellent score, but then he would have still gotten into the course. Does that make sense? If he gets only 51, he still passes, but he still gets into the course. Okay, you don't have to, people who are doing this, you don't have to do that, okay? We're discussing the answers. You don't have to start spamming this in your cameras, okay? So he did not get an excellent score in maths. Well, he could have gotten a very, very poor score, like 51, and still gotten into the course, but he didn't because the conclusion is he failed to get a place in the course. Does everyone see what I'm saying? Which means, let's look at the third one. He failed the maths test. That needs to be, it seems like, the additional piece of information that makes the conclusion true. Because if all he has to do as an experienced computer programmer is to pass the maths exam, that means because he failed to get a place, he didn't pass, which means he failed the maths exam. Okay, he failed the maths test. Now, similar reason why D is not true has nothing to do with chess. He doesn't do the chess challenge at all. He doesn't even do it at all. Now, don't overthink things. Okay, some people were like, oh, maybe D is also correct because what if he did it in his own time and he had some fun and he did a chess challenge? Well, that's not relevant, okay? It has nothing to do with the question. I don't care about if Jun likes chess. Don't care, okay? It has nothing to do with the question. It's irrelevant. Don't overthink things. Don't add extra pieces of information about whether Jun likes playing chess as a hobby. It's not relevant, okay? We only look at what's in the question. And what does the question tell us? Well, he's an experienced computer programmer, so which rule do we need to look at? If a student had at least some existing knowledge of programming, they would get in the course as long as they pass the maths test. He didn't get in the course, which means he failed the maths test. So that's the certainly right answer. Does everyone see how this is like a logical consequence question, but reversed? You have to find the missing piece of information, not the right conclusion. Okay, so before we move on to general tips, let's do a quick summary of the 4 categories we've done so far. And these are the 4 categories that appeared in the practice sample test released by the New South Wales government. The first, of which there were 13 questions, is the logical consequence type. That's when you have a bunch of stuff that I've highlighted in green, premises, bunch of different evidence, and you have to find the certainly right conclusion. That's category 1 and the most common. We have to get good at those. The second one, which I think is the most difficult type, is the strengthen or weaken questions. Now, what's the key to understanding a strengthen or weaken question? The piece of evidence they give you does not have to be relevant to what you're saying. Everyone remember the strengthen weaken question we did on the cars just then? Right? Anne's mother said cars should be banned to protect children for children's safety because of accidents. We don't care about what she thinks because of accidents. We only care about her argument. The argument is that cars should be banned. So therefore, exhaust fumes which are harmful to children means they should also be banned because it's for the children's safety. We only think about what makes an argument stronger or weaker, depending on the question. A third category that we did was find the flaw. There, we need to think about what mistake someone has made. So they've given you a bunch of different evidence and someone has come to a conclusion, but that conclusion is wrong. Now, what's the key part of doing a find the flaw question? Use your common sense, okay? Don't start making up a short story in your head about how one of the mistakes could have spiraled into this conclusion, or use your common sense. What is the person thinking when they made the mistake? What is the assumption they've made in their head? Okay? And the final one is explain when you're providing an explanation for what the premises are, which means you have to find an additional piece of information that makes the conclusion true, like we did for Jun and his maths challenge just then. Okay, now we've wrapped up the majority of what we're doing in this workshop. We're going to go to our final slide, which are the general tips for succeeding in this course. Now, some of you have realized the questions are not necessarily that hard. Once you get used to them, they're not necessarily that hard. But the problem is mainly accuracy of reading and also time pressure. So what are some of the ways that we can do this? Now, one of the first things and the most important tip, just like almost any question you do, is you have to read the question first. Now, what do I mean by the question? Let's go back to this slide just then. The question is the final line before the multiple choice answers. That's what I mean by the question. The other stuff is part of the question, but you have to read where they actually ask you a question. Now, why do you have to read that line first? Because you need to figure out what part of your brain you're using. You need to figure out what logical thing they're asking you to find a reason for. Are they asking you to provide an explanation? Are they asking you to find a conclusion? Are they asking you to identify a mistake or find a strength or a weakness? If you don't do that first and you waste a lot of time reading all the other stuff first, guess what happens? You only have 1 minute to read the question and you just wasted 20 seconds of it reading the question without really thinking about what you're meant to do. Does that make sense to everyone? That's why you always need to read, once again, let's go back to that slide, this line first. What must have been the reason? Okay, Jun is an experienced computer programmer but failed to get a place in the course. What must have been the reason? Now, while you're thinking to yourself, once you read that line, okay, I have to find the missing piece of information. Or if it's a strength and weaken question and you read the words, which one of these most strengthens Anne's mother's argument? You have to think to yourself, okay, that's what I'm looking for, a place to make it stronger. So you always read that line first, otherwise you're going to waste a lot of time. Now, why is time wasting so dangerous in this new section? And it's a very, very tricky section because of this. You have 40 questions and 40 minutes. That's 1 minute per question. Now, sometimes when we get a long question, did anyone find that Jun question quite long? There's a lot of stuff to read, right? Well, in 1 minute, there's a lot of stuff to read. Okay, I gave you a lot of time to think about it. But in 1 minute under exam pressure, and you're sitting there and you're feeling a bit worried, you need to calm yourself down and you need to time yourself. And this is why we must always read the question first, because it saves us a lot of time. Now, the best way to do it, if you can't figure out something, the worst thing you could do is sit there thinking about it for 3 or 4 minutes. Why is that the worst thing you could do? Because then you've shaven down all the time that you need for all the other questions. So my tip to you is, if you're taking more than 1.5 minutes to do any question, you need to move on, okay? The maximum amount of time that you're taking, okay, even 1.5 minutes is a bit long because you're only meant to be using 1 minute per question, remember? But if you get over 1.5 minutes, and don't think about this too much, don't be staring at your stopwatch the whole time, oh, 90 seconds, 90 seconds, don't do that, that'll stress you out. But keep an eye on the clock, and if you're using too much time, the best thing to do is guess and move on. Okay, if you have one answer that you're feeling maybe a bit stronger about, just guess that. You don't have to spend a lot of time confirming it 100%. Guess and move on. Another trick is, because it's a multiple choice exam and you have a question like a logical consequence question, does everyone know filtering stuff out? Does everyone know what I mean? If you find the necessarily right answer and it's A, guess what? You should go, hooray, it's a celebration. I don't need to read the rest of the answers anymore, okay? If you find a necessarily true answer, you don't have to go, oh, B, oh, that's necessarily false. C, that's necessarily false. D. You don't have to triple confirm your right answer. If you know that answer, hey, that's 100% the right answer because this is a certain logical truth, then answer that question and move on. Do not waste time confirming the wrong answers. That's the worst thing you could do in an exam. Once you find the right answer, circle it and move on. But if you can't, within 90 seconds, that's the max cap, okay? Leave it. Guess something first, and if you have extra time at the end of the exam, come back and look at it again. Does that make sense to everyone? You must be moving at a pace. You cannot get stuck on any one question. Now, one thing that you should always do with any question, but especially for logical reasoning questions, which is what this workshop has been about, is you must read with pencil. So have a pencil in your hand and especially try to identify where the conclusion is, what you have to prove. Maybe you can try to find evidence. You should always be making little notes and markings while you're reading. That way you're going to save yourself a lot of time, because remember, like I said, time is the biggest challenge here. If we had 2 hours to do this exam, then you could all sit there thinking for ages and get everything correct. But that isn't the challenge, okay? I know you're all smart and you can all figure out logic by yourselves, but unluckily, we only have 1 minute per question, which means it's also about efficiency. The most efficient way to read a question is read the question first, and then while you're reading, highlight, underline stuff that you think is important that's going to come into use. Or maybe you want to circle the conclusion so you know what you have to prove. You need to filter out the background information. Does everyone remember what we talked about before? Background information, the stuff that's not going to be relevant again. So once you read it once, okay, you know that's the context of the question. You don't need to come back and reread that over and over again, because that's wasting time. Finally, the biggest tip I could give you, apart from reading the question first, is do not bring your own opinions, outside knowledge, experiences, anything like that into the exam. They are not relevant. You can only use what's given in the question. And that's why some of the questions are extremely hard. So for example, let's think back right to our logical consequence run about the architects. Okay, now some people are going to bring in their own opinion. How? Well, anyone who checks their written work carefully must have great attention to detail. Is that true? No, it's not true. Okay, it's not necessarily true, because what if, for example, they're writing and they're really messy, right? And they don't have attention to detail. But when they check it carefully. Well, that's obviously just because you're checking your writing carefully doesn't mean you have great attention to detail. Now, what about the other architect? If you have a vivid imagination and you like doing creative things, does that make you creative? Yes, that's a necessary truth, okay? You can't really say, well, I have a vivid imagination. I love writing short stories, but I'm a very not creative person. That just doesn't make any sense. But, right, you can have great attention to detail, but not check your written work carefully, okay? So we can't bring in extra thoughts that are coming out of nowhere. We can't extend the answers and start thinking about all these potential scenarios. We only use the questions based on the passages and what's given in the question. That's a hard and fast rule. That's the golden rule. And you're going to find yourself making a lot less mistakes if you just think to yourself, don't overthink it. Okay, don't overthink it. Only use what's in the question, nothing else. Cool. That wraps up the substantive matter of my presentation. We have about 10 minutes left until 9 p.m. So I will be happy to take any questions from parents or any questions from individual kids. Now, like I said at the start of the workshop, there are potentially different types of questions that still have to do with logic that didn't appear in the New South Wales government sample exam. Now, if I covered all of those, we'd be here for 6 hours, okay? So I didn't want to do that. But if you sign up for a holiday workshop, we will be going through some potential, it might be in a future exam, questions like that. Now, in the time we have left, does anyone want to ask me any questions about the selective school thinking